All right. All right. Well, first off, thanks. Whoa. I don't do this very often. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate the turnout. This is fabulous. We're really overwhelmed with all the... Pull it a little closer. So thank you to everyone for coming out tonight for the talk. I really appreciate it. And we're really overwhelmed by all the excitement from the fans. And it's just been a dream come true for us. I'd like to thank Jason for inviting me up, along with the IGDA, and also all the IGDA sponsors. So just in advance, I have a lot of material to cover. So I apologize in advance if I go pretty fast. I know people are standing in the back, and I don't want them to get too tired. Also, I'm not the lead designer. I'm not the project lead. I'm certainly not Ken Levine. So please be gentle. All right, so let's just get started at the beginning. Just a little bit about me. I joined 2K Boston, which was Irrational Games at the time, about 2002. I was the lead programmer on SWAT 4 and BioShock. And, I'd worked in a bunch of other industries before that, doing some AI stuff and other types of entertainment. About 2K Boston in Australia, we're formerly Irrational Games. Most of you probably know that. We have 2 offices currently, one in Boston and one in Canberra, Australia. A bunch of our previous titles, we started with System Shock 2 back in 1999. I think that's the right date. Worked on a title for the PS2 that was unreleased, and then did a bunch of PC titles, the most recent of which was SWAT 4. BioShock has a really, really long history, and it was actually interesting kind of trying to think back to the start of it all. This was actually one of the very first things I worked on when I came to Irrational. Started over 5 years ago, and it's gone through a lot of changes over that time, not the least of which is the size of the team. We had people working on this in China, Europe, and Australia, and the U.S. So at the very beginning, this is the very first time we actually tried to do a BioShock prototype. And this goes back to 2002. So at that time, the team had just finished wrapping up a game called The Lost for the PS2, which didn't end up being released. And morale was kind of low on the team, and we needed something to rally around. So we started thinking of how we could build on the past success of System Shock without the license, of course. And we started working on a game like BioShock. And given that we had just finished with The Lost, which was based on Unreal Engine 2 that we just ported to the Xbox, we decided to use that code base to build a prototype of what BioShock might be. So hopefully this works. Let's see if PowerPoint does the right thing. All right. Okay. So some things you'll notice about this demo. It's very dark. I hope you guys can see some of it. Although it looks a little bit like it has a sci-fi theme, it's actually based underwater. This is supposed to be, terrible voiceover. It's actually based underwater. It was supposed to be some kind of underwater research lab. These are the early AIs, which we hate, and we affectionately call the Eel Man. Never design an AI without legs. It just doesn't work. But I think the main thing to take away from this demo is that it looks a lot like System Shock 2. So I'll just pause that right there, if I can figure out how to do that. So that was way back in 2002. And I think we whipped that up over a couple of months in the summer. So as I said before, this is our first attempt at the game, and it's the most System Shock-like of all the attempts. And there's not really too much in common with our future attempts at the game. Whoops. Okay. The only thing we really kept from this was, for a little while we had a concept of changing the gameplay by modifying the pressure in the world, and that was later cut. So we didn't really take much, except that it was underwater. We did keep that, though. So after we worked on that prototype, most of the team moved on to SWAT 4 and Tribe's Vengeance, because we had just signed the contracts for those games. We kept a small team behind to work on BioShock, to try to flesh it out a little bit more, because we had hopes of trying to sign that as well. So there's only, I think, 3 or 4 people that were working on it at the time, doing some concept art and just really high-level design discussions. And this period only lasted a month or two because of the SWAT 4 project grew in size, and we needed to pull those people onto that project. So as far as what came out of that period, I think the most important thing was the story discussions. We had a lot of meetings with like 20 people sitting around the room just kibitzing about possible backstory and setting ideas. And the things that really stayed were sort of rough ideas of genetic experimentation, a story loosely based around post-war politics, and the idea of trying to build a society that was getting away from the governments at the time. It's interesting to note that at this time there was no notions of objectivism or any references to Ayn Rand or anything like that. And the initial notions for the AI design started percolating around this time. The big question for us was, we had a little bit of an inferiority complex at the time. We were a really small studio, and our last big ambitious project didn't ship. We wanted to be a little bit more cautious. And we knew that with only 25 people in one office, and about the same in Australia, there was no way we'd really be able to compete with the bigger developers. Everyone would always have bigger budgets, more staff, better graphics engines, bigger explosions. So we started trying to think of what we could do that would be different, and how would we make people take notice of our little game. And the one area we thought we had a chance in was the area of AI. We were trying to think how we could do this, and we were inspired a little bit by GTA, which had just come out around that time. And we thought that if we could create a living world where when the player was moving around in this world, life was going on around him or her, without that player's direct involvement. And we thought that if you create a world that seemed alive on its own, that would make the world seem actually bigger than it really was. And like I said, we were inspired by GTA, where it's a pretty big world, but it seems bigger because wherever you go, there's pockets of life that are going on around you. And this was the idea. This is where the idea of the AI ecology evolved. We were thinking about things like, well, what if these AIs in the world had lives of their own? What if you had AIs? This is a crazy idea. What if you had AIs that didn't attack you? So we were hoping to take the idea of an AI ecology and use it to advance the genre a little bit. So I have here. This is a little excerpt from Ken Levine's email, Monster Ecology in BioShock, from around 2003 or so. In it, he says, why an AI ecology? And one of the ideas was to advance the state of the art in a unique way. And some footnotes to that say that, like in the typical game, the AI only serves the function of the antagonist. And this has two disadvantages. One is a disadvantage for us, which is that the competition has already done this really well. And the second is that players generally don't have time to observe and appreciate antagonistic AIs. They're usually dead before you get to appreciate the finer nuances of their IK aiming systems. And, we also wanted to enhance the feeling of a living world, because elements that affect the player but aren't directly opposed to the player help enhance that feeling. We thought it would improve the sort of creepiness of the world, because it's far lonelier to be around other people who you can't relate to in any way than just to be alone. And also to increase the simulational depth of the product. When you throw emergent behavior into a game, it allows for situations you couldn't foresee ahead of time, and these kind of things ask the player to improvise. And our idea was that would make for a better gameplay experience. So we came up with this basic ecology idea. We've been tossing around those higher level ideas I just mentioned, and I guess Ken had been watching some nature videos, and he was watching the typical video of the lion on the Serengeti chasing the antelope, and we realized that this is a very archetypical interaction between animals, and people just inherently understand this kind of relationship. You have sheep, shepherd, and wolves. Parents and children and dangers in the world. This is a very easily graspable kind of relationship. So we decided we'd have drones, cops, and aggressors. They were called cops because, again, we were thinking about GTA. But later these correspond to the little sisters and the big daddies and the splicers in the game. And the core of the idea was that the drones are helpless and harmless, but they have a valuable resource that the player needs. The cops are there to protect the drones, but they won't attack anyone who doesn't threaten the drones. And then the aggressors are just sort of the standard aggressor, and they're always trying to get access to the drone's resources. And how the player fit in was that the player would just sort of show up, and based on how he interacted with the other elements, the other AIs in the game, it would determine their reaction towards him or her. So, we worked on that for a very short time, and then we had a long period of no BioShock development because we were going full bore on SWAT and Tribes of Vengeance, and we also started a game called Freedom Force versus the Third Reich, which we actually self-published. So BioShock was put on the shelves, and a good thing that came out of this period was that the tech leads in both of the offices decided that since we were both doing games that were very similar, they were both sort of first-person shooter-esque, and we were hoping to base them on Unreal technology, we thought it would be beneficial to share technology. So we started a code-sharing project. So we started a shared engine. We then branched that engine into each game-specific code base. And whenever we made new features or bug fixes, we'd put them in the shared engine and then branch them down to the teams, which worked out really well. We also finally figured out how to use Unreal technology successfully, which is that Unreal Tech is a great starting point, but it certainly does not replace a fabulous technology team. So don't expect that Epic is going to magically create the technology you need to make your game a success. Just take it, start with it, and run with it. Don't be afraid to modify it to fit your game. That's different from how we used it before, but this time around it really worked for us. And the main reason I bring this up, the tech sharing, is because it was the beginning of a closer relationship between Australia and the American offices, which continued into BioShock. After we finished BioShock, after we finished SWAT 4 and Tribes of Vengeance, we picked up BioShock again with the hopes of selling it to a publisher. We had sort of a regained confidence at that time. We finished 2 projects that were reasonably successful. Actually shipped 3 AAA titles in 6 months, which was kind of hard to believe. As I said before, we wanted to find a publisher to give us some money so we could actually work on BioShock. There was a big problem with our idea for BioShock in that it was inspired by System Shock 2. Now, System Shock 2 was a great critical darling, and it was a commercial flop. So we had a very difficult time trying to convince publishers to give us some money for this, because publishers really have a hard time imagining throwing good money after bad, so to speak. So our question was, well, how do we sell a spiritual successor to a commercial failure? And we started thinking pretty hard. The key was that we really needed to show somehow that there would be a market for this game. And if there was going to be a market for the game, we'd have a better time selling it. But the problem was we had no game at that point. Just a bunch of what we thought were good ideas in our heads. So what we did was we decided to whip up a little demo, something that we could show to the press and to publishers to drum up some excitement for the game. And the basic idea was that we wanted to show something that would inspire people, but not necessarily explain the whole game, because we didn't have time. So we took our existing engine, and in 2 days, I was actually gone on vacation. I had no idea we were doing this. I came back, and there was a demo. It's great when it works that way. All right, I got to try to figure out how to get this to work again. All right, so this is actually... hopefully this is it. Okay, this is the demo that got BioShock signed. It's the 30 seconds that signed us. It's not very exciting. So this was supposed to be set in an abandoned Nazi lab of some kind. You may notice this visual effect is similar to the tear gas effect in SWAT 4. I'm not going to comment on that. And that, my friends, is what sold the game. That's it. All right. So. All right. Okay, so if you're all trying to pull this off, be sure to take some notes. One room, no introduction, no AI, no animation, no UI, and no gameplay. All right, so in summary, it was just a big smoke and mirrors demo. When Ken talks about pitching ideas, he says that you always need to pitch to gamers because gamers really want to believe, and they'll go out on a limb for your idea. So our idea with this demo is we'd create something visual that would give the vibe of the game we wanted to make, and while we were showing it, Ken would give them, the super pitch over top of it. And that actually worked out really well for us. In around October 2004, or slightly before then, GameSpot was preparing a System Shock 2 retrospective on their website. So we had an opportunity to tie into this. And so we took the demo I just showed you, and we showed it to GameSpot, and we had them come into the office, and they sat down and talked with Ken quite a bit and the rest of the team about what our vision was for BioShock. And the resulting article created just an intense amount of buzz and speculation on the websites and in the gaming press. And because of that, suddenly publishers started taking notice. And before we had to go to them, and we were trying to push our idea on them, they actually started coming and talking to us. So that was pretty nice. Everyone wants to be part of something that seems like it's going to be successful, and I think that's the bottom line. If you're trying to pitch a game, find a way to make it seem successful. We had multiple offers for the game, and it was really difficult to decide who we wanted to go with. And we ended up going with Take-Two over several other authors for a couple reasons. One was they had a lot of experience with emergent games, especially with GTA. They had a history of basically their whole business is built around taking gambles on new intellectual property. And they were also trying to build a new brand at the time, 2K Games, which is the label that 2K Boston is under, and also 2K Australia. Okay, so pre-production around January 2005. Oh my God, we have a publisher and a budget. Now we actually have to build something. At the time, the problem was that we had some cool ideas in our head, but we didn't really have a solid. I don't even know if we had a game design doc at that point. At least none that was longer than one page. So we had to come up with a plan, and here was our plan. It was subject to change. The original idea was that we'd finish the game in 21 months, maybe a little bit less if you take into account the console cycle, and we would spend a lot of time on pre-production and get everything right. And then we would just go full bore for 14 months of development. And again, we were a little bit gun shy on our last console project, so we thought we'd play it a little bit safe. We were a little worried that if we were building a next-gen game on a next-gen engine and an entirely new aesthetic and on a brand new console, it might be a little bit of trouble for us. So we thought we'd just focus on the 360 for launch, and then we would do the PC SKU 6 months later. As I said before, we had 7 months total for pre-production. The initial 3 months were standard, pre-pro, working on design and art and technical issues. The design team was actually trying to find a design for the game. The basic idea was that we'd take Shock 2, we would strip out the stuff that doesn't work and keep the rest, and then we'd have a hit game. It's a great idea. So here's a little excerpt from an email here that Dorian Hart, one of our designers, wrote in our internal discussions. He said, BioShock is a first-person game with the methodical and paranoid pacing of System Shock 2 and not the frenetic, adrenaline-fest rushing about of traditional pure shooters. Atmosphere focus will be on the tension born of resource scarcity and audio-visual horrors. Some of that's true about BioShock in the end, but it's certainly a lot more frenetic than I think Dorian imagined it. It changed a lot from the initial idea of just making System Shock 2, and I think the rest of the talk will be focusing a lot on those changes. So what do we want to keep from Shock 2? Well, we wanted to keep the things that made it a scary game. Obviously, these things: resource scarcity, tension, cautious progression, and the stuff that we really wanted to fix. We sat down, we looked at Shock, and Ken, who was more involved than any of us in it, sat down and said, well, what really made it unsuccessful was it was just too overwhelming. It wasn't a very accessible game. We threw every system at the player at the very start of the game. It was just this tangled maze of complicated user interfaces. And to top it all off, we had the advantage of non-competitive graphics. If you remember any of those earlier character models, for the people who've played it, they're frightening, but not in a good way. So one of the design ideas was that, okay, all the AIs in the game need to be evolved for their function. So we had these concepts of, well, we'd have a ranged aggressor type, and we would have a melee aggressor type of AI. And that's all design would say, was sort of that high-level definition. And then the art team would figure out what they would look like. But they had to look like they were evolved for their role in the game. So, for example, a melee guy had to look like he was evolved to beat someone up physically. So that's what the art team started running with, and they were, doing the usual investigation of, how to move to the next generation of rendering capabilities and things like that. The tech team was focused on trying to come up with a new engine for the game. We decided to create a core independent technical team that would focus on things outside of game programming, like how to get it running on the console, those sorts of issues. And so that the game team could focus on prototyping and game systems. And the core tech team was primarily in the Australian office. Our goal, this time around, we really wanted to make a world-class console engine. But we weren't sure what we should use for the technology. Our old engine certainly couldn't compete in next gen. And Unreal 3 looked really good, but it was still in its infancy. Now, this was a really tough call for us. We didn't want to wait for Unreal 3 to be ready for us to accomplish the things we needed and ship on time. On the other hand, we would really like to use their tech because it looked pretty cool. So we had to come up with a compromise. And people often comment that BioShock doesn't really look like a lot of other Unreal 3-based games, and it's because it's not entirely Unreal 3. So our compromise was that we would license everything, all versions of Unreal, and we would steal what we could, but basically assume we'd have to end up writing everything ourselves. And so that's basically where we started, writing everything ourselves. And we added a whole bunch of new stuff to the game. I think the big thing to take away from what we added to the game, and I think what shows up in the final game that you see on the shelves, is that the new renderer we wrote was customized for how we imagined the BioShock worlds would look. We knew that in Shock 2 we got a ton of mileage out of high contrast lighting with lots of mostly darkness but little pools of light, dynamic flickering lights to change the mood, and things of that nature. And we knew that had to be fast. In fact, it had to be almost for free. So that was the core focus of the rendering engine when we started, was making it basically have great lighting, have it be really fast and dynamic, and basically free in terms of overhead. So after we did the pre-production, we started moving on to what we in-house usually call the vision demo. And Alyssa Finley came on board from Stormfront Studios, and in the past she had had a lot of success with the idea of a vertical slice, which is that build a demo that has basically all the key game systems running, even if only in sort of a half-baked form, and get it running on your target platforms and do it really quick. And the goal was basically just to prove that our ideas were on the right track. So this is the vision demo. Okay. Let me see here. How do I go? Oh. Okay. So what you'll notice here in this video, you'll see the gatherers, but you might not recognize them because they're the things that look like slugs. You'll see AIs getting into fights for no apparent reason. You'll see generally unexciting gameplay. And there's a couple things that remain for the game. The weapons are very similar. These are the gatherers, by the way. Notice how slow the weapons firing. Our idea was that a lot of the character growth in the game would revolve around the weapons and that you would be able to make your gun fire faster. Unfortunately, it really sucked when you first got it. Whoops, here's where you'll see AIs getting into fights for no reasons. Oh. Actually, it's not for no reason. It's because this guy, one of our ranged aggressors, was trying to attack one of the gatherers. And that's what we call a drill guardian. He was one of the protectors that I think he ended up being the bouncer with the big drill on his hand. But originally he had two kind of, I don't even know what they're called. But this is where it gets kind of unexciting. So I'm just going to cut out of this. But you can see a lot of the user interface elements are pretty similar to how we did it in the final game. You can see, let's see, we still have different ammo types. And there are plasmids in effect in that demo, although you can't really see them. They're things like regenerating health over time. The other thing that came out of this was the protectors, the big daddies. The basic design of a big guy in a diving suit remained relatively unchanged. So we had a couple successes with this demo. It was actually running on the 360 only by pure luck. I think it started running the morning of the demo. The basics of the ecology were working, and we actually had a lot of game systems implemented, even to a greater degree than we thought. The failures are pretty much everything else. Art direction, gameplay. I mean, the art direction was bland, unexciting at best. The gameplay and the emotional involvement in the game was missing. There was no emotional connection to the game, no sense of fear or feeling of wonder about being in this supposedly undersea world. The AI ecology, while it worked, it didn't make sense to the player. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And with the ecology, what we had hoped would be emergence came across more as randomness, because the player didn't really understand why the AIs were taking the actions that they did. And the big one, the whole idea of Rapture, this wonderful undersea city, just didn't come across, because what it looks like is you're stuck in a cave. What we learned from this process, I have to say it was a pretty painful post-mortem, because we felt that we failed, I think, in many ways. What we learned after thinking about it for a long time and having a lot of discussions is that we spent too much time in this vision demo working on things we already knew how to do. Because of that, we didn't tackle the right questions. We knew that we could make an inventory system. We knew we could make different ammo types and stat modification systems. Those already existed in System Shock 2. They were successful. Why did we bother implementing them? We should have spent more time in that initial period focusing on the things that failed, the art direction, selling the concept of Rapture, the city, and the AI ecology was supposed to be this marquee feature of the game, and we spent, we didn't really look at it very critically. So the changes the art team decided to make moving forward. The key one is Ken kept harping on this idea of let's just get one room that's right. Let's just work until we have one single room that looks like it's part of this world called Rapture. And that's what they did. This eventually led to a pretty successful new art direction, which was the whole Art Deco theme. The other thing they had to work on was the AI models in the game. The original mandate, like I told you, was that AI should look like they were genetically modified for their in-game function. But this turned out to be a really bad idea. It's tough to come up with models whose form follows their function and they don't look really stupid. They end up looking fantastical in most cases and not very scary. And also extreme mutations, physical mutations, make it really hard for the animators to create compelling animations. Another issue is that when you have these crazy monstrous AIs, it's difficult to create a lot of variety in the game because you can't just swap clothing colors and put attachments on them. So here's a couple of the AIs from that period. I forget this guy's internal name, but he was supposed to be one of these melee aggressors, and his arm was evolved to be really big so he could hit you with it. Let me just say, never make an AI with no neck. It's really hard to animate, and you can't use head tracking. So we one-upped that guy with this guy. This affectionately we call this guy Stitchy, because he's got his guts kind of stitched together, and I don't know why he's missing an arm. But he was supposed to be our shotgun-wielding AI. Okay, well, a guy with no neck and one arm is even worse than a guy with no neck. The last thing, this is probably one of the worst things about the demo, was the having the little sisters originally be sea slugs, or some variant on sea slugs. The big problem here was one of our major goals with the ecology was to create a game in which the player had to make moral choices. And the player needs to feel really bad about harming a helpless creature for his or her own gain. But when you look at a slug, your first reaction is just to stomp on it. And there was this completely removed any empathy that the player might feel towards these creatures, and sort of undermined that whole idea. Sorry, just checking my time here. So moving forward, let's see. The design had to work on a better collaboration with art. Previously, design would lay out the spaces and just say to the art team, okay, well, take this pink cube and turn it into environmental decor. That didn't work very well. The art team had a hard time coming up with good-looking spaces that way. And we also decided we had to redesign the AI ecology to make sure the player understood how his or her actions would change the behavior of the AIs in the world. So the idea we came up with was a player-centered ecology. Basically what we took away was that the aggressors no longer go after the gatherers themselves, because it just doesn't add anything. In this way, the player is sort of the focus of all the AI actions in the game. One of the big tech problems moving forward was that we needed a lot of work on our animation, but we knew this going into it, and I'd always assumed it would take the entire project to get the animation looking good, and guess what? It did. So let's see. Sorry, I'm just skipping some of this stuff because I'm running short on time. The other big thing is that we decided we need to rework the the little sister big daddy relationship to sell it better to the player, and we knew that this was going to require a lot more technical work and animation work. So we were going from the slug on the left to the little girl on the right. Why did we choose a little girl? Well, this was a very painful period. There were hundreds and hundreds of different concepts for what we should change these gatherer archetypes to. And everything from monkeys to frogs with tubes on them, and I mean it was just nuts. And everybody had their own favorite version. Monkeys were very popular, by the way. But in the end, what was absolutely vital was that we come up with a design that the player could feel empathy towards. And eventually we settled on the idea of a little girl. Rob Waters, our concept artist, drew some concept faces, I think that were based on the face of Christina Ricci, actually. And we just looked at that and we said, okay, well that's something. I mean, if you hurt this thing, you can't help but feel bad, and that's how we knew we had to change it to the little girl. Here's just some quick concept sketches of how we were going to work on selling the relationship between the little sister and the big daddy. We had to make it clear that the little sister was basically helpless and the big daddy was there to guard her and protect her. So that required a lot of animation work so that we could tie their animations together. We have things like the little sister being helped up into her vent, and also when she's attacked, the big daddies can sort of grab her and put her behind them or put her on their shoulder to protect her. And now we move on to full production. So we hadn't really planned to fail in the vision demo. That was a bit of a problem, and we didn't really have time to go back and do it again. So moving forward, Art started working on the new aesthetic, the Art Deco inspiration. And we got a new art director at the time, Scott Sinclair, who came from Harmonix. well, he was previously at Irrational, then he went to Harmonix, then he came back. And that really helped. The tech team was cruising along on their giant backlog of tech tasks. I think at this point we had a 280-page design document, and we were just sort of plowing through the systems in order of importance. And design was trying to find a design. I mean, they had a design doc, but it wasn't clear it was going to be the right design. This is what I call pretend full production. It's a bad idea if you try to do it. So what was wrong during this period? Well, tech was coming online really well. Art was building levels, lots of spaces. They looked really nice. And design was updating their design docs. And there were really no major crises occurring and no indications of problems. And that was the problem. Because everything was going according to plan, no one was really paying attention to the big picture. There were issues like the design being in flux and systems being cut that had already been implemented, or even as they were being implemented, tech being built too early. Another big problem was art building spaces without gameplay or story consideration. One thing we really learned months and months later as we sort of hit our stride on this project was that you can't build a place like Rapture in a narrative vacuum, because every space in Rapture is designed to sell something to the player, some element of the story, some feeling. And a lot of these spaces art did at the very beginning just had to be scrapped. It's really sad. Let's see. So, no one was reviewing the whole experience, and we were making something, but it wasn't really clear if it was on track to be a good game. And there's a lot of grumbling amongst the team at this point. I think morale was getting kind of low because people in the trenches could see that it just wasn't gelling. And a little bit of malaise was setting in. And there's only one way to fix this, which is the threat of public humiliation. E3 2006. So our E3 demo was really critical. We had to take all of these ideas in our head, all the ideas we knew would be great, and we were talking about them as if they were great, and we had to actually prove that they could work as a game. More importantly, we had to show something that would get players interested in the game at E3. If you think about it, I mean, let's admit it, every part of BioShock is pretty wacky. I mean, the story's weird, the AI ecology is different than what you've seen before, the aesthetic is very strange, the setting is nuts. We had to show how you could pull all these collections of ideas together and make something that would not only make sense, but be interesting and fun. I think we had to convince ourselves a little bit, too. It's tough to remember the whole E3 process. It was a big blur. But I think some of the things that stick out for me personally is that it was I think the first time we started thinking in terms of a coherent player experience rather than just a collection of different game systems. We really started thinking about how can we show the possibilities these open up for the player. We need to show how a player could encounter cool, emergent, nonlinear experiences while still making progress in something familiar, like a linear narrative. We finished the demo, and this was actually, I think, the first time where the team said, wow, okay, finally I can kind of see where this game is going. Let's see, I should have a video here of the E3 demo, but I don't, so you can all go online and find it. And one of the cool things about the demo was that it actually was fairly emergent. We scripted the initiation of some of the encounters that we expected the players would have randomly in the real game, but what happened after they were triggered was actually pretty emergent, and this was sometimes a problem. People running the demos had to look away quickly when AIs started getting into unexpected fights. But that was kind of neat because it wasn't broken, it was just unexpected. E3 was amazing for us. We got a lot of press, and we were very flattered. It was very unexpected. Ken always brings up the phrase, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. And that's kind of how we felt, and it was really nice to get some attention at E3. But there was a problem, which was the public itself wasn't really that interested. We subscribed to a couple services like, I don't know if it's GameSpy or GameSpot or IGN, but they have this Tracks service, which monitors gamer interest in different games through their navigation through websites and other factors. And so while we got a lot of great attention from the gaming press, the actual people going to these websites didn't seem to be all that interested in it. We had to figure out what was wrong. And thinking about it for a while and talking to some people, we realized that the game is really different and intriguing, but it's also kind of confusing. People didn't understand what this game was. Is it an RPG? Is it a shooter? It's tough to be a fanboy for a game like that. So our solution was to change the marketing pitch. And this was around the time where we stopped giving our normal pitch, and the pitch was, it's just a shooter. That's what it is. It's a shooter. And by the way, it's the deepest shooter you've ever played. And that was our new catchphrase internally. I'm not sure if it ever made it externally, but Shooter 2.0. What we wanted to do was take a shooter, make a great shooter first and foremost, but then add some of these cool systems that were in Shock 2 and try to expand on that experience. Another benefit for us was that 2K saw potential for a big hit game, and it would take a lot of money and time and other resources, but they decided to go for it. Thank God. Because we got a large budget increase. We got, I think, about 5 more months at that time. And they also negotiated the exclusivity deal with Microsoft, which is really great because Microsoft is a great marketing partner, and it'll be really good for the game. The next thing to come up was the X06 event. This was another big turning point for the game. This was late September, and we were invited to be one of the few titles that was actually featured on the big stage, I think, that they showed all the gaming journalists. It was obviously a great marketing opportunity, and the downside was that we had only 3 weeks' notice. We were in the middle of a big milestone push, and I mean, things were coming along. Engine and the art direction were finally seemed to be, hitting their stride. Gameplay, it was still a little bit in the rough. But we decided to go for it. The problem with the gameplay at the time of X06 was that it was a little bit too much like System Shock 2. The main thing is that it was just still too inaccessible, too many kind of nerdy systems, too slow. It wasn't really compelling, and we were worried that it wouldn't capture a mass audience. So we decided we had to change that. And some of our goals of the demo were, well, the primary goal was that we had to push home this new Shooter 2.0 message and get the public, not just the journalists, excited about the game. So Ken called a big team leads meetings, and it was one of these, I don't know, we call them come to Jesus meetings internally because, there's a lot of pressure, you got to make painful decisions. And Ken said, okay, well, what's cool in our game? And the leads prepared a list of what was cool. We had a lot of really cool things that had come online. The problem was we weren't really sure how to use these elements to convey the demo message. So we really need to show how game systems could be layered on top of each other to make the player more powerful, how the player needed to use the environment, the AIs, and the plasmids to accomplish these goals. And most importantly, we needed to show why this game was an exciting, visceral shooter as opposed to a slow, cerebral experience. Bill Gardner, one of our designers, came up with a great idea, and he said, well, why don't we take this demo and organize it along a storyline? So we'll start with the player's end goal and then show how he can get there. And the basic story, is that the player needs Adam, which is the genetic currency in the game. And to need it, he needs to get to a little sister. Little sister is protected by the Big Daddy. And the Big Daddy is too difficult just to run and gun and take it on directly. And you see this at the beginning of the demo. But what the demo shows is that if you build up these different game systems and you use the security system and you use the environment and you use plasmids like telekinesis and fire, you can actually accomplish this really difficult goal. And the demo for us was a major success. I think it was probably more successful for us as a team than it was even with the public. But it really actually got the public very excited as well, especially when it hit Xbox Live, the video of it. But for the team, it was a really exciting time because we looked at this and people were cheering when we showed it in the office because finally we could see an exciting direction for this game. The bad side of the demo was that we pushed the engine really hard at the time, and the engine kept up, but the problem is that the demo was like a fraction of the size of a real level. And the worst thing is that after the demo, Kevin comes to me and we're talking about it, and he says, oh yeah, well, I always assumed the whole game would be like that. And that was a low point for me, personally. So now we get into the final push. And I apologize for people standing. There's about 20 slides left. I'll try to cruise through it. But this is a really important part of the development of BioShock. It's about the last 10 months or so. And this is where we made a lot of the critical changes that made it a successful game. So in many ways, the story of BioShock's final development is also a story about focus testing. And it's not the kind of focus testing where you ask the public what they want and then you make it. It was the kind of focus testing where you ask the public what they think and why they don't understand what you've made. So prior to the Exo 6 event, we had done some internal testing, friends of friends, friends of family. It was pretty casual, and we got a lot of feedback, but it was mostly positive. People who are your friends want to be nice to you. And the negative feedback was the wrong kind of feedback. It was the kind of, well, I wish you had this system in the game kind of thing. But what we really needed to know was, would you buy this game? And if not, what's preventing you from buying this game? Most importantly, it had to be feedback that was actionable. So, something we could actually do something about. We didn't have time to make it a cartoon game or anything like that. So what we decided to do was what we call real focus testing, where you actually pay people to do focus testing for you. So we hired a testing facility, had one-way glass and recording equipment and all of that. I think Microsoft and Bungie have stuff like this as well. And we brought in people right off the street, and a whole range of people from people who had never played games before to really hardcore gamers who buy a new one every week. We put them behind the glass. We gave them a sort of a brief introduction to the game, just verbal, and then we let them play, and we didn't help them at all. If they got stuck, we had one guy who got stuck in the first 5 minutes, and he spent the entire 3 hours just trying to figure out how to get through a door. It happens. But the thing is that this kind of thing is going to happen in your final product, and that was really valuable for us. So we took those videos back, and the designers and everybody really watched these videos. This feedback was really important. The critical thing we learned was that a lot of the problems weren't really problems with the game systems or anything like that. They were just problems with how they were presented to the player. The first level was found to be too dense and confusing and not particularly engaging. People would acquire new plasmid powers, but they didn't know how to use them or they didn't care. So they'd stick to just weapons, and then they would feel frustrated because the weapons weren't as good as other shooters. Then they wouldn't choose to interact with the big daddy. So then, because of that, they never got at them, and they wouldn't understand how they could grow their characters. Another big one was that this is a pretty dialogue-heavy game if you played it, and there's a lot of backstory. And our initial presentation was kind of overwhelming. The focus testers were so overwhelmed with dialogue and backstory. They just couldn't process it all, and they kept missing key information. And so the big thing is that the things people missed because of our presentation issues prevented them from seeing why our product was different and how it could be fun. And that, of course, is bad. So this is a big wake-up call for us. We put a lot of thought and care into the game so far, only to see a lot of our core ideas fall flat. So we decided that we're not our target audience, and we shouldn't trust our own instincts anymore on stuff like this. So we decided that we wouldn't make any changes in the future to try to improve things unless we tested them to make sure that they would actually work. So we went back to the drawing board. We redesigned the entire first couple levels of the game, which is the learning sequence of the game. We scrapped the whole gameplay in the first 2 levels. And instead of making it this instantly sandbox, emergent kind of experience, we actually turned it into a little bit more of a linear one. Not completely, but enough that the pace slowed down so that the player could have the time to learn a lot of the more complicated gameplay ideas, such as using plasmids in combination with weapons. Because those kind of ideas are critical to the enjoyment of the later levels of the game. And the proof for us, I think, that focus testing worked is that the focus test is basically essentially the same as the demo we released to the public. And before testing, it was a complete failure, and afterwards, from everything we've heard, people thought it was a great demo. So somewhere around this time, it's not in the slide, but we got an extra 2 months to accommodate a bunch of the changes we had to make. And in the following slides, I'll talk about a couple of the other internal a couple of the changes we made based on internal and external feedback, with the goal basically just to fix things people don't understand. Don't add a lot of new stuff, just fix stuff that's not working right, and make sure the experience is always fun. So one of the big mindset changes is that this game cannot be about stats. It can't be like World of Warcraft where you see numbers floating above AI's heads. It's got to be about what the player can do in the world. This is where the game started really taking shape. It was also kind of a painful time for the team because there was a couple holdouts, a couple people who were still in the mindset that, well, maybe we can turn it back into more of an RPG. But that wasn't to be. And the good thing was that while the changes were painful, the team understood why they had to be made, and everybody really pulled together. So one of the big changes was to tie character growth to plasmid power acquisition. And this was so that people would use the plasmids, which were one of the cooler things in the game. We finally separated the notion of atom from money. Atom was this genetic material, which you used to use to buy everything. But people they just didn't get it. But people understand money. So we separated those two out. Next thing we did was streamline the plasmid growth. What really sucked in the game for the focus testers was that you would acquire a new plasmid, but then you'd have to wander through half a level until you found a machine that would let you equip the plasmid and use it. So we created this new quick equip interface where right when you get a new plasmid, you can immediately try it out. And on top of that, we would make sure that when you got a new plasmid, there was some kind of cool situation set up where you could immediately use it and see why it was so exciting. Last thing is that one thing we noticed through our focus testing was that there's a lot of plasmids in the game, and some were what we call passive plasmids. They give you a long-term stat change, like increase your health over time. And others are active plasmids, which you use more like weapons, something like the Electrobolt plasmid in the game. But this was just too overwhelming for people when they were all just called plasmids. So we created this sort of meta notion of tonics. And just the very fact that we separated them with different words suddenly made it more understandable to people. We didn't actually change anything about them. Another thing we did to try to make the plasmids more rewarding, to get people to use plasmids in progression, was to make it more rewarding. Up until this point, you could actually still kill the little sisters. And the big problem for us was that not so much that the player could kill them, but that they could be killed in a non-meaningful way. Frequently, they would just be friendly fire accidents. You'd be fighting a big daddy and a grenade would go off, and well, there goes this little girl flying off the side of the screen. You can actually see this, I think, in one of the Exo 6 videos if you look really closely. So here's the big problem. It undermined the idea of moral choice in the game, since the player doesn't always have to make a conscious decision. And the second problem is that the player didn't really have to take down a big daddy. He could just distract one long enough to save or harvest the little sister. What we learned from the Exo 6 demo was that if you make the big daddies really powerful, the fights can be really cool. So we said, all right, well, these fights are cool. Let's make them happen all the time. So now the only way to get to a little sister, they're invulnerable until you take out their big daddy. Then you can go to them, you can make this choice, an explicit choice. And the cool thing is, aside from any other quests in the levels, you now have these sort of side quests, which are these little mini boss battles in every level. Ken Levine often tells this joke about System Shock 2, where he says, when John and I finished this game, we really didn't know how the public was going to perceive it, and we wanted to ship a non-skippable cutscene at the start of the game that explained why it was so fun. We didn't want to have to do that with BioShock. Now, Greg Goby, maybe some of the Ubisoft people here will recognize that game. Props to Greg. He's now the VP of Product Development for 2K Games, and he was getting really involved at this point in the process. He would analyze, play the game, all the levels of the game, and literally analyze it minute by minute. He'd come in with these giant storyboards with screenshots of everything in the game. And his big thing was that you've got to capture the player in the first 20 minutes. If your first 20 minutes don't draw the player into the game, it's over. Your game is a failure. So he came to Boston for several weeks. It might have been a month. I don't know. He was there every day working with us, trying to redesign the first couple levels of the game. And those levels are actually what you see in the demo, if any of you guys have downloaded the demo. So the next thing, Greg's big mandate number 2, and is say yes to the player. And this is the one that really gave me heartburn. Greg would sit down there and play, and he would write up these docs and say, why can't I do this random thing? And it was really frustrating because the answer is, well, we didn't design it that way. But I think the more important point was you could kind of do something similar to it. You could pick up objects, but you couldn't pick up dead bodies. You could freeze enemies, but you couldn't freeze machines. Why don't AIs do something when you set them on fire? Why doesn't liquid nitrogen put out fire in the world? Why doesn't incineration melt ice? These are all valid questions. And so he was just pushing and pushing and pushing to make sure that we got these things fixed. And in the end, I think it was a really good thing for the game. It required a lot of new tech. But what it did is it created a more consistent game world for the player. When you get into this world and you think, I wonder if I can do this. And in a lot of games you try doing something, of course, and it doesn't work. But in our game, in most situations, we tried to make it so if you thought you could do something, you could actually do it. My favorite thing, this is my favorite thing from Greg, I'm just going to bring it up because it drove me nuts. Greg would say, why can't I make a Molotov cocktail by lighting a bottle of alcohol on fire and then throwing it with the telekinesis and seeing it explode? So at the end of the day, we wrote like an entire system just to let you do that, so Greg would shut up about it. It's a true story. More things under the Say Yes to the Player umbrella. One of the important ones was adaptive training. We have a great adaptive training system written by Lida Tang, one of our programmers, and it's an expert system that basically watches the player. And it knows about things the player should know how to do, and it tries to figure out when the player is in those situations where he could or should be doing these kind of things. And then if the system figures out or thinks that the player doesn't know how to do them, it then prompts him and says, hey, have you tried this really cool thing? And it adapts over time and stuff like that. And the big problem at this point, the system worked great, but we just didn't have enough hints in the game. So we created a strike team that would go through and play through the whole game and just write down where people got confused or didn't use right tactics. And we made sure that there was some kind of system in the background that would help them out if they got really stuck. And this really helps me because I don't remember half the stuff in the game. We were trying to make sure the player could do cool stuff easily. A lot of people complaining that we have no leaning in the game. Well, leaning was in the game up until this point. We cut it so that we could make a better controller layout so that you could do dual wielding. Prior to that, you could shoot your weapon. If you wanted to change to plasmids, you'd press one button to switch to plasmids, and then you could fire your plasmids. And this way you can just go back and forth. And it makes it a lot more accessible for people. And the last big thing with the plasmids was tweaks to make them more fun. We had a lot of plasmids in the game that were minor plasmids, I guess you could think of them. We would have one plasmid that would let you touch people and set them on fire, and we would have another plasmid that would let you shoot a fireball and set them on fire. The question is, why aren't they the same plasmid? So we took a lot of plasmids, we cut a couple ones that people never used, and we took a bunch of them, we just put them together into single plasmids, and then made sure that when you use those plasmids, the experience was really great. And this reduced the amount of code we had to support, but increased the player's enjoyment of each of those systems. We had a new process at this point. We basically threw the schedule out the window. We realized we had elements of a great game. All we had to do was fix them. So we just started with a list of the things that just sucked and ranked them and created small teams with a person from every department that was empowered to just iterate it until it was good. One problem at this time was the writing was not finished. We had several writers on the project, and we ended up, I think we rewrote the story and the dialogue 4 times. The final story wasn't finished until January, and at that point we were supposed to ship in June or July. We wrote the story, and then Atlas, the main character in the game, we focus tested him, and people hated him. So then 2 months later we had to rewrite him again. And the dialogue wasn't done until March, so this was one of the, not one of our finer points, but we got it done. Let's see. And at this point, it was pretty late in the game. We were maybe 5, 6 months from ship, probably 5. And in the process of making all these changes to make the game more exciting and better, we kind of forgot about stability and performance. because the programming team was just so busy with new gameplay features. So at this time, the core tech team just stopped doing new stuff, and they just went like full time on optimizations, just did a lot of really scary stuff at the very end of the project, like rewriting your physics system 3 months before you ship. It was the right thing to do, but it was very frightening, and there were a lot of bugs because of it. So the last thing I think I want to touch on in this final period is automated testing. Everybody thinks it's a good idea. I don't know how many people do it. We thought it was such a good idea that we wrote an automated testing system at the start of the project and then didn't use it again until the end. But at the very end, we had really, I would say 3 months before we shipped, we had no idea how stable the game was. So a couple people on the team, I think John Shea in Australia and Nick Gardner on our QA team, and Alyssa started pushing for automated testing. And we just said, all right, every single night, every employee is going to run these automated tests. And when you get in the morning, some guy from QA is going to go around and find out how long your tests ran. And if it crashed, where did it crash? What's the stack trace? And that was enormously successful for us. It let us test save load issues. It let us test memory leaks, performance issues, and helped us find some of the crazier crashes in the game. So if you guys start your next project, I highly recommend you use automated testing throughout the whole project. So to continue in this sort of tradition of my haphazard presentation, that's the last slide. I think I went a little bit over time, but that's the project. And these are my own recollections of the project. It's not the official history, but I think it covers a lot of the important points. Thank you everyone for listening, and if you're interested in hearing more about the game or 2K Boston or Australia, I'm more than happy to talk to you after the QA session. I don't know how this works, but thanks. I guess people who are tired of standing up, I apologize. Jason, what do we do? Usually take questions now? Or?
Yeah, we'll do a bit of Q&A.
Okay. By the way, if anyone's curious, the autographed copies of BioShock are autographed by Ken Levine. You can't read the signature, so I just thought I'd tell you.
Okay, and to David, on. Hello. To encourage folks and kind of make my life easier, we're gonna give out T-shirts. So not that we necessarily need encouragement to ask questions, but okay. Question. Yeah. Okay. There you go. First one. Yes, sir.
Thanks. Based on the mood you wanted to create, was there any influence with, let's say, a game like Condemned?
Is this working? We looked at a whole bunch of games, and Condemned was actually one of the games we looked at quite a bit, especially with respect to melee combat. I'm not on the art team, the design team. I think they probably did look at it for mood, but I wasn't specifically involved in that. But I know we did spend a lot of time looking at their animation system and their melee combat system.
All right, and we'll try to keep it to short questions and short answers. Yes.
I caught wind that there was going to be a zoo level in the game. I was wondering how that went about and how it got cut and whatnot.
Well, I'm sure someone has a much longer story from the art team on this, but yeah, at some point, one of the levels, I think Fort Frolic was supposed to have an entire extra third of the map, which was supposed to be this zoo with animals that were still alive in it. And I think sadly that one just got cut for lack of time. Fort Frolic is actually the biggest map in the game, and it was originally 2 separate levels, and we welded them together and sort of cut the ends off each of them.
What RPG elements did you keep and what did you cut and why?
Well, let's see. We have multiple ammo types, weapon upgrading. We have the plasmid systems, which are under the hood. They're just an RPG stat modification system. There's let's see. I'm trying to think what we didn't cut. I mean, I think those are probably the major ones. Sorry. I wish I could answer that better. I apologize.
Hello.
Yes.
Hey, yeah, I'm wondering what made you guys decide to go with a no penalty death system?
It's a good question. One of the things we wanted to do at the very start of the project, which we thought was key to making it a success, was to make it more accessible to the player. And in our experience, one of the things which keeps people from playing your game is when they find it too frustrating. And load times are pretty frustrating. So the original idea was that you could always just get back in the action. Originally in the game, the Vita chambers, you had to explicitly activate them, and they cost you money. But I'm trying to remember why we changed that. And I believe it was actually through user testing, where people got into these resource spirals where they would die. They had to pay money to activate the machine, and they would die, and they wouldn't have any more money, so they keep dying, and then they couldn't find more stuff. And we just said, okay, well, dying is now free.
Hi. How did Ayn Rand and objectivism influence the game in the end?
Well, I think it was a big influence for Ken when writing the story. Around the time we were starting the story, I know he was reading a lot of the original Rand stuff, like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. And he actually brought in, we had a lot of discussions where he would bring in the books, and he actually brought in like Ayn Rand essays and handed them out to everyone. And I think the big thing that he wanted people to get from that was not necessarily like the Rand ideal. Well, it was so people could understand that how you could be in the mind of a person like that, because those ideals are like the ideals of Andrew Ryan in the game. And for all the people who were building the art, even building the tech, but also building the story, he really wanted them to understand how a person like that thinks. And so, in the end, it's not an Ayn Rand story, but it's heavily influenced by those kind of ideas. What would happen if someone with those ideas was actually allowed to do something? So.
I'm just wondering, what kind of system did you run the automated test on? Is it the UI or gameplay elements, something like that?
Do you mean how we? The auto testing system. Is that right? We had a custom system which would just launch the engine, and it would catch a crash. Let's see, how did it work? I can't remember how it would somehow recover from crashes, would write out logs and remember where it crashed, and it could do map cycles, it could do cycles of certain tests. But we didn't buy any sort of third-party framework or anything like that. It was basically, we also didn't have any sort of unit testing framework. It was mostly just, the basic test was fire up the game, randomly move to different path nodes every second, fire guns randomly, switch weapons randomly, that kind of thing.
Working with half your team across on the other side of the world, what were the key problems and how did you overcome them?
That's a good question. There definitely is a lot of problems working with a team across the world. The biggest problem, of course, is the time difference. And for that, I think the key was having people on each team who would meet every night to go over progress. So every night I would call Rowan Wyborn, my counterpart in Australia, and I would just talk to him. Even if I had nothing to say, I would just call him. And his wife actually said I talked to him more than she did. But that's really important because, when you're just sort of chatting about random issues, you suddenly remember those little things that were bothering you during the day or things you overheard in conversations with someone else. Around that time, we also installed these really cool video conferencing systems where we had a giant screen TV and you could go in the conference room, push a button, and it was like a real-time video conference with their conference room. And that's really important, too, because when you meet people face-to-face and they're no longer just like a disembodied voice on a phone, it really builds, I think it builds a rapport between people on the team. That's really important to be able to work effectively. Another big issue for us was just bandwidth. Our files, like one of our texture files, if an artist changed a texture, it would be like 100 megabyte check-in, because we organized our stuff pretty poorly when we started. And that ended up being a huge problem, especially for Australia, because the Perforce repository was in Boston, and it could sometimes take half their day for them to sync data just to get started. So we didn't really overcome that problem except just constantly caching stuff overnight, but it wasn't really resolved, and it's one of the issues we really want to address on the next project.
Excuse me. I'm kind of curious about why you choose to use the Havoc animation system in conjunction with the Unreal Engine 3.
Well, we originally, when we started, we liked Havoc Animation's feature set, and it was a lot of stuff that we were originally planning to write ourselves. I don't know how far along Unreal 3's animation system was at that point, but remember, we started with our Unreal 2 based engine and then added Unreal 3 stuff into it as appropriate. So at that time, we needed to get started early on. We really wanted to test out new animation ideas. Like, one of our big ideas was to do the whole ragdoll, getting up from ragdoll and blending with animation. And we knew that would take a long time, so we just wanted to get started right away. And Havoc had a system that worked for that, more or less. It needs a lot of love from every individual team. But that's why we started with Havoc Animation.
Hi. Did you guys think about reusing your engine for another Xbox 360 title, or is it very specific for BioShock? Did you keep in mind the future of that engine?
Yeah, we originally started while we were working on BioShock. The Australian team was actually planning their own title of the same size, and they were working on it. So it was also a shared engine, just like we had done for Tribes and SWAT. And then as BioShock got bigger and bigger, we started swallowing more people from the Australian team until finally they had nobody left. Everybody was working on BioShock. And the project they were working on kind of got put on hold. So we stopped updating sort of the basic shared engine and just focused on just the BioShock code base. But originally it was supposed to be for multiple titles.
Hi. You mentioned the push to sort of shooterify Shock 2 so you can make it marketable and I guess easier to port to the console. You can sort of take the success of BioShock to the bank. So do you plan on maybe making your next game maybe more of an RPG, putting back those complex elements into them, or are you sort of happy with the shooter direction of BioShock?
Well, I mean, we're very happy with BioShock. One thing you said, like the push to shooterify the engine wasn't to put it on a console; it was to make it more accessible. But as for your question of, are we going to make our next title more of an RPG? I don't have the answer to that. That's really a question for Ken Levine. But I think we're very open to adding more RPG-like elements as long as they're accessible to players. And that's the big problem we find with really complicated RPGs is just they're really kind of nerdy endeavors, and they're great. They're great for people who love to do that and are willing to invest the time into them. But if you want to make a game that a lot of people like, you have to make a few compromises.
Hello? Hi. I'm just curious to know how everybody felt when Irrational became 2K Boston.
Well, there's a lot of nostalgia tied up with the Irrational name, but people were sad. They've been with the company for a long time. I think, at least half of the people in the company have been here for 5 years or longer. So, but at the end of the day, it's a decision by the parent company, and I think it's the right thing to build the 2K brand, and I think everyone understands that, regardless of whether or not it makes them sad.
We're going to go till we run out of T-shirts. Everyone doesn't mind, I guess. All right, sir.
Yeah, hi. So I bought the game and... Sorry. There was a lot of discussions on the internet about instability, like on multiple computers. It was crashing or saving issues. I myself had some problems, as well as with the first patch on the Xbox 360 that led to slow frame rates and all that. How does that is affecting you? And
well, obviously any issues with instability are very frustrating for us because we want people to be playing our game and enjoying it. The issue with the hitching and stuff like that after the title update on 360, we've actually heard from Microsoft it's a problem with their caching file system. We're working with them really hard to try to get another title out to work around those issues. That's really frustrating. I mean, you do everything you can to make sure it's a great title, and sometimes stuff slips through in testing, no matter how hard you try. But we're doing our best to address that. There's efforts underway definitely to try to fix as many issues as possible. Sorry.
Hello? Okay. BioShock is an underwater game. So how much of the water effect did you actually put in the game? And how much did you actually...
Sir, what was the end of the question? How much did we what?
How much did you actually fake just to create the mood?
I'm not really sure how to answer that question. I mean, all the water obviously is fake, but we like to think it looks pretty good. We actually had many different water systems for the artists, and it's true we did have like an effects artist and a programmer who spent most of their time working on the water. There were systems that made it easy to make water that flowed over pre-existing objects. Like you could take a brick wall and you could apply a special shader that would allow it to actually flow and follow the cracks of the normal map and things like that. There were also there's a special shader for what we call deep water, and the deep water actually has physics actions associated with it to do floating and bobbing and triggering, splashing and stuff like that. And in the DX10 version, there's actually a more advanced simulation of the water that actually does rippling and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, like we don't really care how much is like a correct physical simulation. What we care about is, does it look good? Does it look right? And does it keep you in the world instead of taking you out of it?
Hey, I'm still over here on the same side. I was wondering what, roughly, if you could give me this, what proportion of your total budget went to software licensing?
I don't really have those numbers, but you know, I honestly, you know, I don't sign the contract, so I don't know what's negotiated, but I know we spend a pretty big chunk of change on licensing. I can tell you that much. I mean, we licensed Havoc, we licensed Bink, we licensed Fmod, you know, just lots and lots of stuff. You know, we'd much rather take something that's already built and make cool game systems than try to reinvent the wheel.
At least.
Finally.
Yeah. What makes you remove all the multiplayer part in your game? Because in a game or 360, PC, and with the huge interactivity you can think easily of multiplayer, but what makes you remove it? It will take without the time, without just... Okay.
So why did we not have multiplayer?
Exactly.
Well, this is actually a decision from the very beginning of the game. The thing is, Irrational has had multiplayer in every single one of its previous games, and you know what? Nobody really plays it. SWAT 4 is probably the only game that still has a sort of a vibrant multiplayer community. And at the time, actually, we were looking around at other games like Call of Duty had just come out on the Xbox, and we looked at the games that were out. You know, there were probably 20 or 30 titles out with multiplayer, and there's maybe one or two that people are actually playing. And we said to ourselves, well, we can spend, everyone who's done a multiplayer title knows that that's like half your budget is just getting multiplayer right. And you can't compete in multiplayer unless you go whole hog and you really make multiplayer focus. So we said, why waste, you know, our time trying to build a multiplayer mode that's going to be non-competitive when we could put all that into the single player experience and try to make it better that way. So that was a conscious decision. It was never cut. It was just never started.
Hello. I was wondering, are there any plan to release all the Irrational games on Xbox Live?
Oh, I shudder at the thought of trying to get System Shock 2 interface usable on a gamepad, but I don't know the answer to that question. You'd have to talk to our various publishers, you know, Vivendi and EA and all those people, because you know they own it, we don't. But I think it would be cool.
BioShock did a wonderful job of acclimating the game to the world of Rapture. And I was wondering what you felt through testing did the best job of accomplishing that.
Oh, that's a tough question. I'm not sure if I can answer it, but I mean, that was really a lot of what our focus testing revolved around was the initial, you know, I talked in the slides about the first 20 minutes of the game. And it was key that by the end of those 20 minutes, the player really bought into the idea of Rapture. So a lot of what we focus tested was those initial things you see when you play the game. You know, the plane crash movie sequence, the speech by Andrew Ryan as you go through the bathysphere to Rapture. And just what you see and what information is given to you in the very first few minutes of the game. And those things were rewritten many, many times because we found that players, like I think in our first focus test, people said, "Oh, well, this is kind of a cool looking world, but like, how did I get here? Where am I? Am I like in a submarine base? Am I, people just didn't get it." And so that whole, the initial intros were really carefully tailored to make sure that they were understandable to the player, and the player got the key information about where he was, how he got there, and what he was supposed to be doing really early in the game.
Okay, so this will be the last question, so we'll save your special T-shirt there for the...
Oh, sure.
So now you pick. This is was the internal...
Yeah, this is a Rapture security T-shirt that was only given out to the team, so, sell it on eBay.
So you pick someone. You pick.
Oh, I pick. I don't want to pick. I don't know. You pick. No, I don't want to be the bad guy.
Okay, that guy's got a big long arm. That better be a good question.
In your presentation, you mentioned a pressure feature that you had to cut because of time. I was just wondering if that was more of a changing the physics of the actual gameplay, or if it was more just like a damage feature that you were trying to implement. Yeah, well, that was actually one of the early ideas for how we were going to differentiate the gameplay from Shock 2. We know we wanted to make the environment a key focus of the game, like the player being able to manipulate the environment. And when you're underwater, you don't have so many options, but pressure is one of them. I guess what originally happened was that you could change the pressure from high to low to normal, and when you did that, the lighting would change everywhere. Fog would roll in and things like that. When you went to high pressure, pipes might start leaking and bursting, and it would affect the AIs. Like certain AIs would be very difficult to fight in low pressure, but easy in high pressure, for example. Some machines would behave differently in different pressures. But in the end, we had to cut it because it didn't make sense to the player. It didn't even make sense to us, actually, because it's really hard to feed that back. And another big, how do you change an AI? How do you make it animate a high pressure animation? What does that mean? It ends up just looking like wonky, like he's at the disco or something. But the other thing was that it tripled the amount of work the art team had to do because they had to relight every single room for each of the pressure combinations. But there's a funny story associated with that. We wrote the whole pressure system that did kind of cinematic lighting transitions, and we wrote a whole dynamic fogging system and stuff like that. And then we decided to cut the system. And then like a year later, I found out the designers were using it to do like scripted lighting sequences and stuff like that. And I had to go back and support it again. So programmers, if you ever cut a feature, strip it out. Otherwise, people will use it.
Okay, that's the last question. Thanks very much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
Too much. Who wants an E3 hat? Oop.